Hello everyone. So today we are going to study chapter number 4 from class 12, that is world politics, or we can say civics. So this chapter 4 from class 12th book is called India's External Relations, and we will try to finish this chapter in about 1 hour. All right, let's start. This chapter mainly focuses on four major parts, that is how India's external relationships were made and formed, and basically how our country's foreign policy is made, and how the operational policies were made, the history of India's relationship with our neighbors, particularly China and Pakistan, and how India's nuclear policy emerges through future and how it was made. Let's start with the chapter. India was born a very trying and challenging international context. The world has had witnessed a devastating war and was grappling with the issues of reconstruction. So here I believe we are talking about the World War II that everyone in this world was involved in. Yet another attempt to establish the international body was underway. Many new countries were emerging as a result of the collapse of colonialism, and most new nations were trying to come from terms with the twin challenges of welfare and democracy. Free India's foreign policy reflected all these concerns in the period immediately after independence. Apart from these factors, at the global level, India had its own share of concerns. The British government left behind a legacy of many international disputes, partition created its own pressures, and the task of poverty alleviation was already waiting for fulfillment. This was the overall context in which India started participating in the world affairs as an independent nation state. So here we can understand that these are the four things that we have to make sure that we understand what we were dealt with. These are the cards that we were dealt with. So these are the four things that we have to consider. The British government left behind a legacy of many international disputes that were present. The partition created its own pressures and division between the society. And finally, the task of poverty elevation was already waiting for fulfillment. So these three things are something that is important, and we can note these down. All right, moving on. As a nation born on the backdrop of World War, India decided to conduct its foreign relations with an aim to respect the sovereignty of all of the nations and to achieve security through the maintenance of peace. This aim finds an echo in the directive principles of state policy. So here we have a reference of the directive principles of state policy, that how India's foreign policy is based on the directive DPSP. Just both internal and external factors guide behavior of an, here we would zoom in, all right. Just as both internal and external factors guide the behavior of an individual or family, both domestic and international environment influence the foreign policy of a nation. The developing countries lack the required resources to effectively advocate their concerns in the international system. So they pursue more mindset goals than the advanced states. They focus more on the peace and development in their own neighborhood. Moreover, their economic and security dependence on the more powerful states occasionally influences their foreign policy. In the period immediately after the Second World War, many developing nations choose to support the foreign policy preferences of the powerful countries who were giving them aid or credits. This is very important, as we will finally come to understand what is NAM, that is the non-aligned movement. Here it says that many of the developing countries, they were depending on powerful nations for their aid and support, so they were supporting them. So they were supporting them in their foreign policy. This resulted in the division of countries of the world into two clear camps. One was under the influence of United States and its Western allies, and the other was under the influence, just a minute, and the other was under the influence of then the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union broke up, and thus now we have USSR or Russia. You have read about this in the book on contemporary world politics, that is book number 1, I believe. An experiment called the non-aligned movement. This is going to be a very important term in this chapter because India is a founding member of the non-aligned movement. So, all right, moving on. As you read there, the end of the Cold War changed the context of international relations entirely. But when India achieved its freedom and started framing its foreign policy, the Cold War was just beginning and the world was getting divided into two of these camps. Did India belong to any of these two camps in the global politics? of the 50s and the 60s? Was it successful in conducting its foreign policy peacefully and avoiding international conflicts? So here we are asking your question. Here we are asking, here the NCERT, here the book seems to ask you that what do you believe? Was India correct in not involving itself in any part of this group, any of the group? So the second topic is the policy of non-alignment. India has always followed the policy of non-alignment, and we'll be reading about it here. The Indian national movement was not an isolated process. It was part of a worldwide struggle against colonialism and imperialism. Imperialism. So now we know how to start this answer, that why India was against any of these groups. We were against colonialism and imperialism. It influenced the liberation movements of many Asian and African countries. Prior to India's independence, there were contracts between the nationalist leaders in India and those of other colonies, united as they were in their common struggle against colonialism and imperialism. The creation of the Indian National Army by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose during the Second World War was the clearest manifestation of the linkages established between India and the overseas Indians during this freedom struggle. So, where did we get the first connection with the outside world was by the Indian National Army. Indian National Army created by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose during the Second World War, clearest manifestation of linkages established between India and the overseas Indians. Overseas Indians, OCI. We get the mentions of OCIs here. All right. The foreign policy of a nation reflects the interplay of domestic and external factors. Therefore, the noble ideas that inspired India's struggle for freedom influenced the making of its foreign policies. This is a very important. This is a very important note that we can make here, that the noble ideas that we had, the struggle for freedom, it influenced the India's foreign policy that was made. But India's attainment of independence coincided with the beginning of the Cold War era. As you read in the first chapter of the book, Contemporary World Politics, again, the first book, this period was marked by the political, economic, and military confrontation. So, period of economic, political, military confrontation. Remember this: a country is being born, and we are in the starting only. We are in midst of a political, economic, and a military confrontation. It's a very difficult time for the country. At the global level, between the two blocs led by the superpowers, the US and the USSR, the same period also witnessed developments like the establishment of the UN. This is a very important thing that happened in world history. Creation of the nuclear weapons, as we are going to read above, read further ahead. All right, creation of nuclear weapons and emergence of a communist China. So China was a communist China also started to emerge right around that time. All right. And finally, the beginning of decolonization. I remember this question came in and mains exam, that the process of decolonization. Please elaborate on the process of decolonization. So India's leadership had to pursue its national interest within the prevailing international context. All right. So here we will understand the role of our first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. The first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru played a crucial role in setting the national agenda. So he set the national agenda. That's the first thing. All right. He was his own foreign minister. And why is this book saying this? We are going to read further. Why is he his own foreign minister? Thus, both as the prime minister and the foreign minister, he exercised profound influence in the formulation and implementation of India's foreign policy. Now comes the important part, from 1946 to 64. This is an easy year to remember because it's just the opposite of 46. So 1946 to 64, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. All right. The three major objectives of the Nehru foreign policy were to preserve the hard-earned sovereignty. This is important, to protect the territorial integrity, which we are doing right now, and to promote the rapid economic development, which the government is doing right now. All right. Nehru wished to achieve these objectives through the strategy of non-alignment. Now, how this was achieved was through the strategy of non-alignment, and that's an important point. Parties and groups in the countries that believed India should be more friendly with the bloc led by the US because the bloc claimed to be pro-democracy. There were some people who wanted us to side with the US because US was pro-democracy. On those lines were leaders like Ambedkar and other political parties which were opposed to communism and also wanted India to follow pro-US foreign policy. So here we have Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who wanted us to be with US bloc, and some other parties who were against communism. Also, they wanted us to stick with the US bloc. India to foreign. These included the Bharatiya Jan Sangh and later the Swatantra Party, but Nehru possessed considerable leeway in forming the foreign policy. So we have three people who wanted us to side with the US side. That is, first of all, the B.R. Ambedkar, the father of the constitution, and then we have Bharatiya Jan Sangh, or the Swatantra Party, that wanted us to side with the US bloc. All right, now we understand the distance from the two camps. The foreign policy of independent India vigorously pursued the dream of peaceful world by advocating the policy of non-alignment, by reducing the Cold War tensions, by reducing how? By reducing the Cold War tensions and by contributing the human resources to UN peacekeeping operations. We are going to understand why UN is such an important thing for India. You might ask why India did not join either of the two camps during Cold War era. India wanted to keep away from military alliances led by US and Soviet Union against each other. As you read in the book, in the previous book, the US-led North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is the NATO. You have to understand, this is the NATO that we're talking about. NATO was formed by US, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. If anybody attacks US or its allies, the US and other allies are going to fire back. The Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, and thus the Soviet formed the Warsaw Pact. Another major important thing here, we have to understand the NATO versus Warsaw. Yes, please don't mind the handwriting. All right. Came into existence. India advocated non-alignment as its ideal foreign policy approach. This was a difficult balancing act, and sometimes the balance did not appear perfect. In 1956, when the Britain attacked Egypt over the Suez Canal issue, India led the world protest against this new colonial invasion, because from the starting only we are against imperialism and colonialism. So this goes. But in the same year when the USSR invaded Hungary, India did not join its public condemnation. Despite such situation, so here is something that you can give the example about, that when the US attacked Egypt, when Britain attacked Egypt, India intervened. But when USSR invaded Hungary, India did not intervene. Despite the situation, by and large, India did not take independent stand on various international issues and could get aid and assistance from members of both the blocs. While India was trying to convince the other developing countries about the policy of non-alignment, Pakistan joined the US-led military alliances. So here we can understand why US was supported, Pakistan was supported by United States. The US was not happy about India's independent initiatives and the policy of non-alignment. Of course, you can see it in their foreign policy. Therefore, there was a considerable unease in the Indo-US relationships during the 1950s. The US also resented India's growing partnership with the Soviet Union. You have studied in the last chapter strategy of planned economic development, also adopted by India. This policy emphasized on import substitution. The emphasis on developing a resource base also meant export that export-oriented growth was limited. We will read this once more. The emphasis on developing a resource base also meant that export oriented growth was limited. Why is that? Because you can understand that if we are using everything for our development and our growth, then we would not be exporting much as other countries would be doing. So that's why export growth was limited. This development strategy limited India's economic interaction with the outside world. So because we were focusing more on ourselves and our growth, we were not able to export or give the outside world much of the factor or much of what India produced. So now we are going to understand the Afro-Asian unity. Yet given the size, location, power, potential, Nehru envisaged a major role for India in the world affairs and especially in Asian affairs. His era was marked by the establishment of contacts between India and other newly independent states in Asia and Africa. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Nehru had been an ardent advocate of the Asian unity. Under his leadership, India convened the Asian Relations Relations Conference in March 1947. March 1947, an important date to remember, 5 months ahead of attaining its independence. India made earnest efforts for an early realization of freedom of Indonesia from the Dutch colonial regime by convening the International Conference in 1949 to support its supports its freedom struggle. So we helped Indonesia to get its freedom from Dutch invasion. India was staunch supporter of the decolonization process and firmly opposed racism, especially apartheid in South Africa. The Afro-Asian Conference held in Indonesian city of Bandung in 1955, commonly called as the Bandung Conference, marked the zenith of India's engagement with the newly independent Asian and African nations. Newly independent Asian and African nations. The Bandung Conference later led to an establishment of the NAM, the Non-Allied Movement. This is going to be very important. The first summit of NAM was held in Belgrade in September 1961, and Nehru was the co-founder of NAM. These are very important. This paragraph is a very important paragraph. They had to understand that we had the first summit in Bandung that was the first Afro-Asian conference. So Afro-Asian conference was held in 1955. That was where it was held in Indonesia in Bandung, and this then converted to the non-allied movement or the NAM. All right, so now we're going to move on to China and understand our relationships with China. Unlike the relationship with Pakistan, Free India began its relationship with China on a very friendly note. After the Chinese Revolution in 1949, we have to understand 1949, there's one more thing that happened. Of course, this international conference for the freedom of Indonesia from the Dutch colonial regime also happened in 1949. India was one of the first countries to recognize the communist government. Nehru felt strongly for this neighbor that was coming out of the shadow of the Western domination and helped the new government in international fora. Some of his colleagues, like Vallabhbhai Patel, were worried about a possible Chinese aggression in the future, but Nehru thought it was exceedingly unlikely that India will face an attack from China. For a very long time, the Chinese border was guarded by paramilitary forces and not the army. The joint enunciation of the Panchsheel, the five principles of peaceful coexistence, by the Indian Prime Minister Nehru and the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. So, who was the Chinese Premier? The Zhou Enlai was the Chinese Premier on 29th April 1954. 29th April 1954. So, you can understand that here we are signing something very important for our democracy and peace of the two countries. But you will understand that China was always a backstabber, and what happened next will make you a firm believer in our policies. Was a step in the direction of a stronger relationship between the two countries. Indian and Chinese leaders visited each of the countries and were greeted by large friendly crowds. So how did something like Indo-China war happen? So we have to understand these cartoons are also very important. We'll look at them in the end of the chapter. All right. The Chinese invasion of 1962, a first important war that India fought was the Chinese invasion against the Chinese invasion. Two developments strained this relationship. We understood that India had such an immense and friendly relationship with China, then why something like this happened? So there are two things that happened. Tibet in, just a minute, yes, China annexed Tibet in 1950 and thus removed the historical buffer between the two countries. Tibet acted as a buffer between us and China, and when Tibet was annexed, thus it removed the buffer between both of us. Initially, the government of India did not oppose this openly, but as more information came out the suppression of Tibetan culture, the Indian government grew uneasy. The Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, sought and obtained political asylum in India in 1959. So his Holiness took asylum in India in 1959. China alleged that the government of India was allowing anti-China activities to take place from within India. So now you can understand The relationships were starting to strain. A little earlier, boundary dispute had surfaced between India and China. India claimed that the boundary was a matter settled in the colonial time, but China said that any colonial decision did not apply. So this was something that we can take care of. So this is, I believe, point two, and point one would be here. So two things that strained the relationship was, first of all, China annexing of Tibet, and the second thing is boundary dispute. The main dispute along the western and the eastern end of the long border, China claimed two areas within the Indian territory: Aksai Chin area in the Ladakh region of Jammu and Kashmir, and the much of the state of Arunachal Pradesh in what was then called the NEFA, the Northeastern Frontier Agency. Between 1957 and 59, the Chinese occupied the Aksai Chin area. This is still disputed, and built a strategic road there. Despite a very long correspondence and discussion among the top leaders, the differences could not be resolved. Several small border skirmishes between the armies of the two countries took place. So here we can see that our relationships are getting worse and worse day by day. First, they took a part of Exai Chin, and then second, they started building roads there. Strategic, and that too a strategic roads. A strategic road mean that a road that can be majorly used for military use and can be used as a forward operating base for any country if it decides to attack us. Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in Chapter 1 of Contemporary World? While the entire world attention was on the crisis involving the two superpowers, China launched a swift and a massive invasion in October 6, 1962. All right, so here you can see that whenever the world politics or the world media or the world had their eye somewhere else, China was the one who took the advantage of this fact and they attacked us every time. So in October 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis was taking place, then China attacked us, and during this time also in the COVID crisis, when every country was figuring out was busy handling their own war against COVID, China again raised a border dispute with us in Ladakh, where our soldiers were martyred. So you can understand that China always has this war tactic that it uses, that whenever the world is not seeing, they will attack their neighbors. All right, we can understand the psychology of China from here. We can understand the basic also. The first attack lasted 1 week, and the Chinese forces captured some of the areas of Arunachal Pradesh. So this is an important task. The second wave of attack came next month, while the Indian forces could block the Chinese advances on the western front of Ladakh. In the east, the Chinese emerged to advance nearly to the entry point of Assam Plains. So they came as close to Assam. In the next wave, they came as close to Assam as they could. Finally, China declared unilateral ceasefire and its troops withdrew where they were before the invasion began. So this is something very important, because if they would have entered, then we would have waged war against them. It would have been a continuous war. The China war dented India's image at home and abroad. India had to approach the Americans and the British for military assistance and to tide over crisis. So here we are asking for aid and military intelligence. The Soviet Union remained neutral in this conflict. So you can understand that we, however, supported the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was neutral at this time. It induced a sense of national humiliation at the time. At the time of conflict, it induced a sense of national humiliation and the same time strengthened the spirit of nationalism. So one thing we can all understand, that when when a disaster like this happens, the whole country is united. There's a very great example for this. You can understand that after 9/11, what happened, that all the Americans, they came together to help and to help out in each and every possible way that they could. So always understand this: after a times of crisis comes a time when everyone works together. So we can call it a call for nationalism. And when you can understand this fact, you can also understand that most of the countries also use this for their use. So, for example, in World War II, when the Nazi Germany was present, Nazis declared Jews as a crisis to the Lebensraum or the living arrangement for Germans. So hence, when they had this crisis, when they have a common enemy of Jews, they had nationalism inbuilt in the German citizens. Any country that declares an outside crisis or an outside enemy will always have nationalism, a spirit of nationalism grow in its citizens. Any country, you can see any country that goes on a war, they have a sense of nationalism inbuilt in them. The citizens have a sense of nationalism inbuilt in them. All right, moving on. So the top army commanders either resigned or were retired. Nehru's close associate and the then defense minister V. Krishna Menon. This is very important. V.K. Menon resigned at that time, had to leave the cabinet. Nehru's own stature suffered as he was severely criticized for his naive assessment of the Chinese intentions and the lack of military preparedness. So why was Dr. Jawaharlal Nehru so criticized? Because first of all, he believed that China could never do something like this. When he's a prime minister and a foreign minister for a country, he should be more prepared. We expect the person at that stage to be more prepared and not to miss anything. But that was a problem that he missed this, and it costed us greatly in this Indo-China war. For the first time, a no confidence motion, sorry, for the first time, a no confidence motion against the government was moved and debated in Lok Sabha. Soon thereafter, the Congress lost some key by-elections to Lok Sabha. The political mood of the country had begun to change. So we can understand that people were starting to understand that why it happened and who was responsible, and they weren't happy with this. The Sino-Indian conflict affected the opposition as well. This and growing rift between China and Soviet Union created inconcilable differences within the Communist Party of India, the CPI, ladies and gentlemen. CPI, students, everyone, please pay attention to this. The first mention of CPI is here. The pro-USSR faction remained within the CPI and moved towards closer tie with the Congress. Another faction was closer to China and was against any ties with the Congress. The party split in 1964, and the leaders of the latter formed the CPI Marxist, the CPIM, Sitaram Yechuri. In the wake of the China war, many leaders of what became the CPIM were arrested for being pro-China. So this is something that is very disturbing to understand, that why are the people of a country siding with China when we just had a war with that country? So this is something that you have to ponder on and think on. So what this means is that CPI, that is the National Political Party, broke into two factions. One remained CPI and one remained CP. One changed the name to CPIM, the Marxism. All right, the war with China alerted the Indian leadership to a volatile situation in the Northeast region. Northeast has been volatile since then. Apart from being isolated and extremely underdeveloped, the country also presented India with the challenge of national integration and political unity. Understand this, we had the issues of national integration with Nagaland, Manipur, all these North Indian states. The process of its reorganization began soon after the China War. Nagaland was granted statehood, Manipur and Tripura, though union territories were given the right to elect their own legislative assemblies. This is what we can say the after effects, as we can call it, after effects of the Indo-China War, or the Sino, I'm sorry, what was the name? The Sino-Indian conflict. Yes, this is the name we can call it, the Sino-Indian conflict. What happened after the Sino-Indian conflict? These are the two things that happened after the Sino-Indian conflict. This is the first thing, CPIM. This is the national politics are changing. Second is the Northeast region became volatile. And third thing we can also write is that the spirit of nationalism grew. Our defense minister quit, and the leading and the ruling party suffered tremendous loss in the elections. All right, so this was it. Hope you liked it. We will continue with the next part, that is wars and peace with Pakistan, in the next video. Thank you for tuning in. And if you have any doubts, please write in the comment section. It was amazing to help you out. And read this chapter again if you want to. And this is a very important chapter because it really helps us to understand what the foreign policy was and how we made it, how we came to what we are today. All right. So in the next video, we'll talk about the Pakistan war. It's a very interesting war, and hope to see you guys in the next video as well. Thank you. Do subscribe for more informative and UPSC content. Thank you.